ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to another evening of local history. I think we have a very interesting evening prepared. I have two guests tonight. Both of them are military men. I feel right at home with them because I was in the Army myself. Very undistinguished career, but I was there. One of my guests is Lieutenant Brian C.D. Sim, who is a member of the present Elgin Regiment and the foremost military historian in Elgin County, and also the foremost expert on military badges in Elgin County. And my other guest is Lieutenant Colonel E.G. King, who served with the Elgin Regiment overseas, and at the present time is the honorary colonel of the Elgin Regiment. And from here on in the program, he'll be known as Ed, if he doesn't mind me dropping the lieutenant colonel. Now, I'm going to start out with what we're going to talk about this evening is a mishmash of two topics, although they're really related. The one topic is the military history of Elgin County, which of course goes back to 1803 when Colonel Talbot came here to start the Talbot settlement. And it's a tradition that has continued to the present day. And our Elgin Regiment is well and healthy and operating out on Elgin Street at the Armories. And as well as the military history of Canada, what we want to talk about is the Elgin Military Museum. Some of you have seen something in the paper about that, and the efforts that are being made to found a museum in conjunction with the present excellent Pioneer Museum that we have in St. Thomas. And I think Lieutenant Colonel King, or Ed as you're known from here on in, what about this military museum? What is the purpose of it?
Well, the purpose of the military museum is preserve just what you were talking about. Everything militarily historical having to do with Elgin County from 1803, the beginning of Colonel Talbot's regime, until the present. Every phase of it. And the history of Elgin County militarily is broader, I think, than, or as great as any portion of Canada, any part of Canada. And the museum, of course, is to set up and preserve this for educational purposes. If we felt if it wasn't done now, a lot of this material would disappear completely. And a lot of it has disappeared. But a lot of it is coming out of the bushes now and being offered to us, and we're tickled to death for this.
And I wonder if I switch over to Brian and ask him, most people think the military museum as being guns and cannon and tanks, and maybe the kind of collection that Dr. Berger had down on Ross Street, which I'm sorry we couldn't have for a museum. It would be, he had some great things. What kind of things are there, Brian, that would go in a museum that would be of interest to people?
Well, basically it is made up of anything, of course, related to the military in Elgin County, and things that we have now are uniforms and badges and all sorts of paraphernalia that were required to run an army all up through the period of time. Bits of equipment that were issued during both the Great Wars and the paraphernalia that went along with that. And probably more important to the people of Elgin County is the actual written histories and the documents that are available, and even more important than that, I think, are the photographs that where people can recognize their relatives and just see exactly how the military life was conducted in those days.
I'd just like to remind our viewers that Brian was one of the authors of this book that was put out, what, last year? A year ago?
77.
A book called The Elgins by Captain L.A. Kirchen and Lieutenant B.D. Sim. And it's one of the finest productions of county military history in Canada. And I say that without being chauvinistic about Elgin County. It really is a remarkable piece of work. How many volumes were printed in this?
Originally 1,050.
1,050.
Right, of which 300 of those were a special edition.
Yes, and the Elgin Regiment sort of backed the printing of this, did they?
Yes, it did. It was primarily the responsibility of the colonel at that time, Colonel Warren, and myself.
Now, are there any of these left?
There's about 150 of the standard copies left.
And where are they now?
Richard Cockrell is distributing.
Well, there's a splendid Christmas present for somebody if you want one. The history of the Elgins. And this, although the Elgin Regiment name doesn't go back that far in history, this book does go back to the War of 1812 and the Fenian invasions and so on. Now, so you think there's lots of material?
Oh, there's tons of material that we've already collected, and there's a lot more material. The existing Pioneer Museum has an excellent assortment of military artifacts in their own collection. I have a fairly extensive collection, or things that have been put in my custody until the museum gets going.
Well, listen, could we take a minute and talk about some of the things that you have here?
May I interject just a moment?
Yes.
You said it wasn't going to be a display of weapons, and it won't be per se, but there will be weapons, we hope, of all the various periods and the personnel and the concern. So there will be quite a considerable display of weapons. Sorry.
That's a call getting ticked off by the colonel there. You know, I forgot about that. Brian, you've got a couple of weapons here now that Ed has talked about those, and maybe this is a good time to talk about them. What is that one you're holding?
This dates back to, it's dated 1862, but after the first Fenian invasions in 1866, in the spring of 1866, the British government armed the Canadian militia with about 70,000 of these particular weapons. This is one of they're a half-inch in diameter, just like a small shotgun shell. They're single breech loading, single shot, and they're accurate. I fired this one. It's accurate about 200 or 300 yards, and it's stamped in this case with 25, which designated the militia unit that it was sent to, which was the 25th Elgin Battalion of Infantry at that time. It also has Dominion of Canada stamped in it, and many other proof marks.
So this is an authentic one-shot rifle from the 1860s.
Yes, it is.
And we have ammunition to go with it.
Right, and specifically from Elgin County.
And it's also belonged to the 25th Battalion. Now you have one other weapon there.
This is probably more typical of what was used prior to 1866, and it would have been a personal weapon of one of the pioneers, the settlers in the area. It's an old cap and ball, and it's a muzzle loader. You put the powder in a ball like this lead one here in it, and it's what they had to equip themselves in those days with pretty well their own uniforms and any other equipment that was necessary to run a militia at that time. And that took place up until about 1866.
Now that's what, about half an inch?
Yeah, it is. It's
the diameter.
Probably like a 10-gauge shotgun.
It's just like a 10-gauge
Yeah,
shotgun.
it would be very, very, very similar to that.
Now, would they use that also for hunting? Would that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It'd be a very important part of the pioneer's life at that time for getting game and small birds and deer and anything else. Well, shotgun, not deer, but small game in this case. There were rifles exactly similar to this that each of the settlers probably would have had. This ball, by the way, the regiment used to practice and camp in the flats below Lyndhurst. And there is an old sand hill in that area, and 2 or 3 of these old flattened out lead balls were dug out of that sand hill in the spring.
There's one that's really flat.
That's hit a stone or something, and they were dug out in the springtime, and the hill is just, or probably was at one time, just full of these things.
You'll have every kid in town out there this spring be digging around trying to find. This would be the old 25th Regiment or the St. Thomas Fallen.
Right, it'd be the old rifle company camping ground.
Well, you have a picture of that area.
Do you have a
Brian,
picture
where they're
of
camping?
That camp?
Yeah, I don't know whether they can try and hold this steady.
Oh, it's hard for them to pick that up close, but this is the flats on Lyndhurst. That's pretty good there.
Yeah.
And all the tents. What date is that roughly?
We think it's about 1885.
Oh, yeah.
Period. The original of this photograph is courtesy of the Elgin Pioneer Museum. They had I believe it was out of Dr.
Curtis?
No. I'll think of it in a second. A large collection of photographs. Flyer, First World War.
Dr. Carey?
No. I'll think of it in a minute.
Scott?
We'll come back to it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that was the where they practiced.
Cameron. That's who it is. Thank you, sir.
Colonel Cameron.
Right.
Who was it?
Colonel Ian Cameron.
Oh, Ian
Ian's
Cameron.
collection,
Yes.
And it shows the flats, and if you stand up on where the gas station is today, you can pretty well see that whole area is
Yeah, right
pretty
at the
much
west
intact.
end of Talbot Street, and
Yep.
just look over the hill, and that's where that's also where the old swimming hole was, and the first pumping station
Right.
in St. Thomas. Well, back to Ed about how old is the idea of having a military museum?
Well, actually, it started back between the First and Second World War with Lieutenant Colonel Warren Andrews, the time he commanded the Elgins. Had proposed the idea and couldn't raise enough interest.
No.
And it's been discussed many times since, and it's been discussed many times since the end of the Second World War. But 5 years ago, Colonel Herb Warren got about 20 people together at the armories. And you'll recall this, Brian, you were there. And at that time, he had thought of an Elgin Regiment museum, a regimental museum alone. And after discussion, we decided this was too narrow, that the entire military history should include all services. And it was too important to confine it to the Elgin Regiment. So we decided at that time, and there was a committee out of that group of 3 of us.
Now, who were those 3?
Myself, Bob Chamberlain, and Herb Warren.
Yeah.
And we were to look for sites, and which we did. Arrived and eventually arrived at a site, which is the building next to the. We decided that the project was viable, and to make sure we got going on it, we borrowed $500 and took an option on the building without having another penny. In fact, we were $500 in the hole to
Now,
start.
where is that building?
It's right directly west of the present Pioneer Museum.
Yeah.
And it is our thought eventually that we may connect the 2 of them up by a passageway to make them more or less mutually self-supporting.
Ed, I'm sure there's going to be some criticism from, there's always criticism from people whenever you try to start a project, but some people, it seems to me, will suggest 2 places that it should have been. One is the Elgin Regiment itself. Now, I know you've thought these all out very carefully. Could you tell us why you didn't want it there?
Well, for one thing, we wanted to get away from the strictly regimental museum because it wasn't broad enough. We looked at, a place we looked at was the old jail.
Yes, now that's another one that someone
has suggested, but the cost of operation was going to be too great. And we looked at various other places, old buildings. The cost of renovations were going to be too great. The building we have picked out, and on which we have the option, is practically the same age as the present Pioneer Museum. In other words, it goes back to about the 1840s, along in there. The present Pioneer Museum have areas set up. They have parking areas, rights of way, the whole thing, to which we'll contribute, of course, from the property we buy. And this, to us, made it more viable than the fact that we might sometime get together and operate in conjunction with one another to cut down the operating costs. Because the operating cost is going to go on as long as the thing's in existence. And it's our hope, and we're almost sure it's going to happen, and will be for a long, long, long while. Because we've
Can I just interrupt? Now, my understanding is that if you'd taken the jail, or you'd put a separate building out beside the armory, you'd have had to wreck the building, but if you took the jail, you'd have had to supply upkeep and a curator or security.
That's right. We'd had permanent people there.
So this way you feel by buying the building behind the present Elgin Pioneer Museum that you can put a laneway there, and that they go into it from the Pioneer Museum.
This is our hope, yes.
Yeah.
And we've discussed this. We've worked very closely with the Pioneer Museum people who have been most helpful.
Yeah.
And they have, as you know, a terrific organization. I only hope that we can have a group of people working for us as they have. It's fantastic what the women at the museum.
The Elgin Pioneer Museum, you know, has been run on a shoestring. And I'm not running it down when I say that.
Oh,
the
no,
Women's
I
Institute
know
and the
this.
IODE of St. Thomas has helped them a great deal, but those women have devoted a tremendous amount of time. And,
Yeah, terrific.
when you think, you know, of their campaign to get it started and get it going, and of course, I suppose you hope as that you'll be successful with military memorabilia as they've been with getting so much donated to that museum.
If we ever get near to them in the same amounts,
Yeah.
we'll be the happiest people in the world. It's just a shame to me, and I'm guilty up to a few years ago, that I hadn't gone through that museum. It's one of the finest I've ever seen of its type.
Yes, yes.
It's
Yes, I don't
everyone
think,
in St. Thomas should go through it.
Pardon?
Every person in St. Thomas should go through it.
Oh, I know they should. And it's surprising, I suppose, the number of people who haven't been there, you know.
I would say 80% of them have.
No,
It's a
it
shame.
is an absolutely first-rate museum,
it's
and
marvelous.
a big, a fine thing to have in a community. Eh?
Yes, indeed.
Now, I think what so you've got the committee of three, and then you got the site,
So,
and then you formed a bigger committee, eh?
well, at that time, we decided we'd form a larger committee,
Yeah.
and we'd limit it to 12 at the present
Yeah.
time. And we picked people for the committee we knew
Yeah.
would be of tremendous help, who would work and who were vitally interested. And
Well, Ed, could you just read off that list of names of that the
Yes,
12 men
I
in
would
that
like to.
committee?
I'll give them their military ranks, if I may.
Yes, do.
There's Lieutenant H.C. Cameron. He's a lawyer and a legal man. Major R.S. Chamberlain, M.C., who's the vice chairman. Mr. A.J. Clark, who's our financial man.
No,
He's
what-
with Winespear Higgins.
No.
Mr. Chuck Fern, Fern Ford, who was an ex-member of the Algan Regiment, went overseas with them. Wing Commander Fred Green, whom I think everyone in St. Thomas knows.
No.
Captain Jack Jennings, who went originally through the Algan Regiment.
No, he has an MC too, doesn't he?
Yes, I beg your pardon, yes,
Yeah.
MC.
Yeah.
There's myself, Major Ray Knight, who's a dentist, Lieutenant Harry Metcalf, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Metcalf, an ex-commanding officer, the next honorary lieutenant colonel of the regiment, Major Chuck Raven of Raven's Shoe Store, my brother-in-law, incidentally, Brian Sim, and Lieutenant Colonel Herb Warren, the just appears returning retired commanding officer of the.
Now, I know you've done a lot of talking. What do you figure it's going to cost? Or what would you, if the money would just flow in? This is the problem with trying to raise money for a museum. If the money would just flow in, how much would you like to have? I mean, this is not an excessive amount. This is what would...
Well, we've set ourselves an objective of $250,000. I personally doubt if we'll ever reach it. But $250,000 would be the ultimate. It would be make it absolutely perfect. We could never fail. If we get 200,000, I will be extremely happy. And there isn't a doubt in my mind now that we will get the $200,000. We started, when was it, Brian? The first week in October, eh?
Yes, sir.
And we now have approximately $50,000. And we really, this has been mostly from local industry and foundations. We've approached all the foundations we could approach across the country. And a few letters that we've mailed out. We're doing it piecemeal so that we can handle it piecemeal. And this will be going on probably for the next 6 months.
Yeah.
Now we have to pay for this building, take up the option.
Yeah.
In 3 weeks.
Yeah. Well, you think you'll have enough to pay for the building?
Well, I think we will.
Yeah, I hope so.
think we'll. Oh yes, we have between pledges and actual cash, we have approximately $50,000 now.
Yeah.
And that's the first big.
Well,
step.
I certainly hope you get it, and I'm sure you will too. I think you took quite a gamble in taking an option on the house, and But you know, if you hadn't done that, if you just talked about it, we wouldn't be anywhere, right?
Well, you got to take the bull by the horns somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
And this is what's happened in the past. Nobody would do it. So we decided we had to do it. Not me, but a group of us decided, well, let's do it now. If we don't do it now, why, it'll never be done.
And this group is meeting about once a week now.
Right now, we're meeting once a week. We're having our last meeting till after the first of the year, this Friday night, but we have been meeting once a week.
And so what you've done so far is you've been contacting, you've been working piecemeal, I think was the way you expressed it.
Yes, in small groups. Because very few of them are retired like myself.
Yeah.
And they have a job to do, their own work. And this is why we're doing it piecemeal. Now, eventually, we'll be enlarging this committee a great deal more when it comes to actually setting up the museum.
So what you've done so far is approach some foundations, and you've been quite pleased with your reaction from them. And you've just started mailing out letters.
Within the past month.
It's not really a selected list of names, it's sort of people you know.
Well, it's people we know, and yes, this is basically what it is, or people we have advised, people that have expressed interest. And
now, if anybody who's watching this does want to make a contribution to the Elgin Military Museum, how should they go about it as a result of this?
Happy to give it to you.
Okay.
They can write to myself at my home address is the address we have for the museum now, 74 Rosebery Place, or get in touch with any member of that committee that I just read out. And
or they can get in touch with Brian. Well, Brian's on the committee, or you can get in touch with me if you can't get in touch with any of these more important people.
And don't forget yourself that you're on part of the committee too.
I'm on a subsidiary part, but those 12 names you mentioned are the people who have done
set it up.
All the basic setup and the groundwork and so on. I'm terribly interested in it, and I'd be glad to help you any way I can. Now, I've got a question here. Do you anticipating having a kind of general campaign that's directed at everybody?
Well, there's no way we can send a letter to every home in town. But we eventually hope to make a general canvas some way, and we haven't decided how we can do it. It isn't the sort of thing that we can do, for instance, like the Red Feather campaign, though it isn't called Red Feather now, is it? You know what I mean?
One of the things I think you'd like to know is this museum, when it's finished, and when we not only have all the material in it, but as Brian points out, we do have the records of the 91st Battalion and the Elgin Regiment. But what you'd like to have is records of every person in Elgin County who had any connection with the military, no matter where he's living now. Eh?
That's right. If we can, oh yes, because we want to set up archives.
I know I've written a couple letters to people, one in Calgary and one in Toronto, and the one in Toronto ran a store here for maybe 10 years, and then he joined up that special services force that Jennings was in. And if you have any suggestions of names, I mean, any of the people who are watching, if they know of someone from here who's in Calgary or BC, that would you like their names?
Oh yes, anyone we think will make any contribution of any size, we'd be happy to have their name and write to them. Because what we want now is money.
Yes, I know, and that's what's always hard to squeeze out of people. I was lying awake in bed the other night and saying, well, you could have 250 people give $1,000 apiece, that'd be $250,000.
Wouldn't that be easy?
It'd be very simple, but it's hard to find 250 people give $1,000, and really when the crunch comes, it's going to be a lot of small donations from a majority of people who are giving, within their reach, eh?
That's right, within a person's ability to give.
I certainly think it would be worthwhile, because there must be, there must be about 10,000 people who, from Elgin County, in one way or another, who were in the services, from the First World War and the Second World War.
Well, there were close to 5,000 from Elgin County in the First World War.
In the First World War?
In the First
5,000?
Close to 5,000.
Well, there must have been more in the second, eh?
Yes, because of the Air Force, which they didn't have to any degree in the First World War, though there were some people there, but it was a large thing.
Yeah.
There were 150,000 people, I think. I'm very close to being correct. That went through.
How many?
150,000 people went through TTC down here.
Oh, that's another thing. What about all those people who had were out here, did their training at what's now the psychiatric hospital? How many thousand went through?
I think I'm not too far when I say 150,000 in the period of time it operated. Yeah. It was tremendous. This was, as a county in Canada, any county, there were more people involved in wartime that went through Elgin County than any other county in the Dominion Canada that I can think of.
It was probably the largest military center per capita in the Second World War in Canada.
It was.
Yeah, I would think so, just because of the number of people.
That was kind of interesting, wasn't it? Because Mitch Hepburn, I came here in '39 to start teaching school. That was my first connection with St. Thomas. And I came at the tremendous salary of $2,000 a year, you know. I thought I really had it made forever. I'd only been making $1,300 where I was before. And I thought, gee, I really should join the Army, you know, but I thought I couldn't pass up that salary. I had to have that for a year or so. But when I came in '39, and the war broke out when I was on my way here, and Mitch Hepburn had just finished the new, most modern, newest, up-to-date mental hospital. They were called mental hospitals in those days in Ontario.
Sure.
And then that was turned over to the government because of the war and became the Technical Training. Is that the right name? Technical Training Center for Commonwealth.
For the Commonwealth Air Training.
Yeah. And we had people here from New Zealand and
Australia, all over the world. Free French.
Then they had the Fingal Bombing and Gunnery School.
School de Aylmer.
School at Aylmer.
And an auxiliary air school at Yarmouth Center.
Yeah. If we'd get in touch with every one of those people, $1 apiece and to get us in there, wouldn't it?
Would it ever?
Yeah. Listen, I think let's leave the museum for a while and go back and talk about the military history of Elgin County. And Brian, we're not going to do it thoroughly, but we start with Colonel Talbot, who was 1803, and he was a 5th Regiment of Foot.
Yeah, he was originally had served in the Peninsular campaigns on the continent.
That's in Spain. Yeah.
Yes, and then mainly in Holland in his particular case.
Yeah.
And he had gained the rank of lieutenant colonel at a very, very young age with that regiment. It's interesting to note, too, that the early ties that were with Elgin County and the old country are still with us today, because the present Algan Regiment is allied with the old, what was the old 5th of Foot, or the old Northumberlands, which is now the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, or part of that.
And so that we still have a connection with the regiment that Talbot was lieutenant colonel in.
That's one of the units he commanded, yes.
In the early 1800s.
Right.
Is now the Northumberland Regiment, and that's the affiliated regiment with the Elgin Regiment of St. Thomas.
Yes, right.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is there anything of Colonel Talbot's around that, any military thing of his?
Military items, I have never seen any.
I was thinking last night, did he ever get any medals? Wouldn't he have got Peninsular
He
War?
should have got a medal. They weren't issued until 1847, but he should have got a medal for his service in the Peninsular Wars.
Yeah. Well, then Talbot, in the War of 1812 and 14, when we only had about 200 settlers in what's, the London district, that is, say, all the counties of Middlesex now, and all the
this
counties
was part of Middlesex,
Elgin.
wasn't it?
There were about 200 families, and they raised a regiment of militia, didn't they?
Yeah,
the first Middlesex militia.
Right, and the Militia Act of 1808 required that anyone between the age of 18 and 60 serve in the Canadian militia and could be called up for a period of 6 months if necessary.
What they always tried to do, though, was call them up in between sowing and harvesting. They had to get their crops in, and when they were called up and it was time to harvest the crops, they were a little mad. You have
Relative to what you're talking about, that era, there's something that Brian brought along here.
This is, I don't know whether the cameras can
No,
pick
but
this up.
go to the Elgin Pioneer Museum, and the original of this document is there.
Yeah,
Now, what
it's-
is it, Brian?
It's a commissioning scroll dated 1812 and signed by Isaac Brock, who was president of Upper Canada at that particular time, and was given a captaincy to Leslie Patterson, who we'll see all through the military history of Elgin County up and into the rebellion of 37-38.
Yeah, Leslie Patterson came in 1808 and settled.
The most valuable document.
And that's in the Elgin
It's
Pioneer
in the Pioneer
Museum.
Museum.
Now.
Yes, it is a very valuable document.
Did not Colonel Talbot command the particular unit he was
Yes,
attached to?
his
at that time?
name
This is
is-
captain in the 1st Regiment of the Middlesex Militia.
Right, commanded by Colonel Thomas Talbot.
That's right, commanded by Colonel Thomas Talbot. Well, we can't spend too much time in that War of 1812 to 14, although that's my special interest right now. But in 1814 particularly, this area was a sort of no man's land. The Americans had control of Lake Erie, and they had Detroit. And we didn't even have control of Lake Ontario. Lost naval command all over. And the Americans made raids all the time from what's now Port Huron and Detroit. And poor old Talbot in this area, they were raided 4 times in 1814. In January, well, I guess 5 times if you count the January one that happened down at Rondo. January and June and August and September and November. And what those raiders did from Detroit, they were mostly Indians, or they were white men disguised as Indians. And the one in August the 16th, 1814, they took all the clothes anybody had except what they were wearing. And they took their blankets. And they took their horses, if they had any. Not too many people had horses then. And then they'd kill a few cows and a few pigs and have a hasty meal and depart, you know. Then in September, they burned the mill that Talbot had, and people had to go 30, 40, 50 miles to try and get any grain ground. Well, then, after 1814, we'll skip that. We come on to 1837. And, Brian, what about our military history in 1837?
Well, this was, as far as its effect on the community, this was probably the most serious effect. It had a tendency, first of all, to split the alliances within the community and the loyalties. And it left for many, many years an unfair question in the minds of many of the senior military people in both the British and Canadian governments as to where the loyalties of the people of Elgin lie.
You didn't tell us what happened at that time, what caused that breakup.
Well, it was basically the Mackenzie Rebellion.
Mackenzie Rebellion,
Right. And there were 2 and 3 engagements, and this was the attack across the ice by the St. Thomas Troop of Cavalry at Point de Pelée, Point Pele, brought about the first casualty, fatal casualty that we know of, that's recorded, of a military member from Elgin County. And, sir, would you mind passing me that sword? This particular saber belonged to a member of that troop of cavalry, Fisher.
Oh, Madison Fisher.
Madison Fisher, and has been in the family for a number of years. And here, about 3 or 4 years ago, the family contacted me and said that there was no one to pass this on to. Would we like this? And of course, they passed this on and several other items. And we've got a photograph from a little later of Madison Fisher, and showing the uniform, the typical cavalry uniform of that period.
And that's the sword he would have carried when they charged across the ice at the Americans on Point Pele.
Exactly. They were encamped in a bushy area there, and Parrish, the chap who was shot, was killed while charging across the ice.
Can I just go back? You were talking about the bad feeling that existed in the county because the people down at Sparta were members of the Reform Party, and of course some of them did take part in this rebellion. That was a sort of comic opera affair, really. It didn't amount to much, but the fighting at Pele came as a result after that, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
But Colonel Patterson and Talbot, but Patterson in particular, didn't, in the west part of the county, there wasn't this division.
Oh, that's true.
Because Patterson wouldn't let them go and arrest somebody on sort of some suspicion, you see what I mean? Whereas here, the people from St. Thomas, the young hoods who were Tories, would ride their horses down to Sparta and break into houses and break into people's property and steal things and say, you're just rebels, you know. And but that didn't happen in the west end of the county, because I think Patterson was a kind of man who wouldn't let that happen. He was a strong justice of the peace.
A lot of people in this area, too, who were accused and who fled the area, did come back later and resettled in the area and lived on. But there were also people. There were 2 men who were hanged for their participation, and that type of justice left a lot of hard feelings also.
It's a typical thing about, I suppose, when you have a rebellion. Poor old Purley and Doane were taken over to London and hanged, and Lawton and the doctor down there, I can't remember his name, who were the main instigators of the reform movement in Yarmouth. They, of course, fled the country for a while and came back and took up their property and never suffered at all. And poor old Doane and Purley were just sort of private, so to speak, and they got hanged. When we go on from that 37 rebellion, can I go back and say one thing about 1812 to 14? That war was the war that really gave Upper Canada, this part of Canada, a real feeling of unity and that they belonged, eh?
Yes.
That they were important because they played a big part in fighting against the Americans.
Yes.
You know, and it really gave them a sort of esprit de corps and a sense of that they belonged to a country that was important.
And incidentally, did they not take Detroit from the Americans temporarily?
Yeah, but not our people. That was Brock and the regular soldiers. Some of our militia went there.
Went with them.
There were about 100 men under Captain Metcalf.
Yeah, but that was Captain Metcalf from Norfolk.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's Lieutenant Colonel Harry Metcalf's he's a great
uncle of Harry. Harry's got his Detroit medal.
Oh, yes.
Which is very interesting. But no, some of our militia were at Detroit, eh? And Brock's regiment, of course, or his soldiers, traveled by boat along the shore, and they stopped at Port Stanley one night, and a couple of boats stopped at Colonel Talbot's the next night. But the whole capture of Detroit by a small group was one of the most extraordinary military victories in the world. And I think anybody that had a part in that would really be proud. Well, we're kind of skating over this pretty fast. We come down to 66 when we had some more troubles here, a much more prosperous area then, and that was the Fenian troubles. Now, Brian, who were these Fenians?
The Fenians were an organization that had come from Ireland. It was known as the Fenian Brotherhood.
Yeah. And
they very openly indicated to the Canadians exactly what they were going to do. They sold the property up here, divided it all up, and advertised publicly for an army, which they got. In the spring of '66, they came across the frontiers on 2 or 3 places, and to a minor degree invaded Canada.
Yeah. Now the main one was down at Lime Ridge, in the Niagara area.
Right.
And then we were always afraid they were going to come across the lake in boats at Port Stanley, you see, and or Sarnia.
Right.
And the St. Thomas Cavalry served in Windsor, and the Rifles served at Sarnia.
That's right. And there were 4 or 5 companies that were independent companies prior to that. The St. Thomas Rifles, the Gun Infantry, the Aylmer Infantry, the Tillsonburg Infantry, and the Port Stanley Marine Company. Very interesting. There were only 3 Marine companies in the whole of the Canadian Militia Organization.
Yeah, now, I think Colonel King there has a...
here's a medal.
A medal.
And this is issued to a Private W.H. Goff, the Port Stanley Marine Company. And the heading is the Fenian Raids of 1866.
That's the Fenian 1866 medal, eh? And that's...
Brian has a better picture of it.
Yes,
there,
here are a couple more in This is a picture of the 1866 London Field Battery with two of the Fenian medals that are the same as... now, we got three of them in this room, and they're all Elgin County people. It gives some indication of that our militia was a very active militia.
Yeah, there was
that's your wife's...
a cousin of my wife's great-grandfather.
I see, yeah.
Or great-great-grandfather, William T. Goff.
And he was in the Port Stanley Marine.
In the Port Stanley Marine Company. As Brian said, there were only three
Well, how
units
many of
that
the
had
Port
Marine
Stanley
companies.
Marines, you say there were only 3 companies in Canada?
In the whole of Upper and Lower Canada
Is
at
that
that
a
time.
fact?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And one of them was involved with the Ridgeway Lime Ridge engagement. None of our people that we know of actually saw any fighting. There was some indication that some of the Tilsonburg people, in fact, were down at Lime Ridge, but I think it was really after the fact and once they were trying to refortify the frontier.
But nevertheless, even though we didn't do any fighting, it was a kind of anxious time.
Right.
And the city of St. Thomas, I think, paid all those volunteers 50 cents a day. And they asked the county wasn't going to pay 50 cents a day for the county members, and it got to be a sort of little bit of an argument in the county council and a few adverse comments in the Times Journal, because these men, you had nobody look after your wife. If you went away with the volunteer rifles or the cavalry, you know, you didn't get any allowance for your wife and children. You know, you just took off and you were maybe away for a couple months, and so the city of St. Thomas said they'd pay 50 cents a day, which would buy quite a bit of food in those days. You know, that would be enough. But the county thought 50 cents was pretty high, and they had to have a couple meetings before they decided they were going to pay 50 cents to the volunteers.
Not only food was cheap.
Pardon?
Not only food was cheap, George. I recall seeing an ad in the 1831 Liberal, you could buy a gallon of whiskey for $0.25.
That's right, yeah.
The men who
Of course,
served...
now, you got to remember, Ed, whiskey isn't a food, eh?
The men who served in the rebellion, though, were granted 150 acres of land at the end of this up north. In fact, way up north at that time, and there was the government's attempting to colonize and open up the north a little more. But and the Fisher family that we've mentioned a couple of times, that piece of property was still in the family up till just a few years ago.
Was it really?
Yes.
They took the 150 acres up north, eh?
Right.
Well, then, we should mention, we said the Fenians were Irishmen who wanted to overthrow the British government in Canada. And the interesting thing is, at that time in Upper Canada, the majority of people were really Irish. The majority of the population was Irish. And the Fenians didn't get any support, really, from the Irish people in Canada.
No, really?
They carried their hatred of England over to the States, and it's still there today. You know, the American Irish tend to be very strong supporters of Southern Ireland and of the Fenians, and there was some funny engagement. One poor fellow up at West Lorne hanged himself because somebody said he was a Fenian, an Irishman who was working there. And another little girl saw some boats landing up at West Elgin, and she went and spread the alarm, and all the farmers came up there with their pitchforks and what rifles and things they had. But it was just some lake boat that sent a couple boats ashore to get some fresh water, you know. Now, then we come to 1870, the first of the Northwest Rebellions.
Right. The 1870, the Fenians again came across the frontier. But out west, what was the west at that time, Riel showed his face to the majority of Canada for the first time. And General Woolsey led an expedition which was titled the Red River Expedition in an attempt, and they did in fact quell that particular uprising at the time. There were several men left from Elgin County and were involved in that first
Now,
rebellion.
you have the medal of one of those men, a man named Mann,
Yes.
which is an old Elgin County name.
William Allen Mann. There was only a very small contingent. They usually selected 2 or 3 long service members of the local militia from each militia unit to make up what was the Ontario and Quebec battalions that went west.
I wonder how we're fixed for time. Whether we... We have 10 minutes, so we can go on. Well, all right, that was the first Northwest Rebellion, 1870.
Right.
And we have things from these people for the museum also, don't we?
Yes, we do. There's bits of uniforms and several photographs. We do have the one medal.
Yeah.
And it's mainly written material, like diaries and letters from the area. One thing that is interesting, and we really haven't been able to prove, but the Fenian Raids took place immediately after the American Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
And this was a souvenir that's been in a local family for quite some time, that is an American water canteen, wooden water canteen,
oh, yeah.
and was reported to have been picked up along the Detroit frontier, where the St. Thomas Troop of Cavalry was stationed both in 66 and 70. So that's
interesting. It's made just like a barrel, isn't it?
Like a barrel, eh?
Yeah. And it's all small little pieces bound together with steel banding. And I imagine if it's kept filled with water, it would probably expand and be most practical for their use at that time.
So that would be an American, it's even got a man's name on it, E. Aarons. Eh?
Yeah, I think that is probably, the way it's stamped in there is probably the manufacturer.
Manufacturer's name. Okay.
I would imagine they were.
That's a water bottle, isn't it? We always think they didn't know how to solve problems. Listen, Brian, what about some of these hats we have on the table here? Any of these go back that far?
Yes, this one, again, belonged to Jonas Spittler Barnes. Mr. Barnes and 4 of his sons were all members of the St. Thomas Troop of Cavalry. And this is, as an officer, as a cornet, a junior officer in the cavalry, this was his hat, and he was reported to have gone to military college.
Huh.
And
it didn't give you much protection from anything.
No, that one wouldn't.
Suppose they looked elegant, eh? Yeah.
And this is from the Fisher family collection, and it's a senior NCO's, it's a sergeant's cap from the Troop of Cavalry. We really haven't been able to find out too much information on these, and have never seen a badge that was worn by the, there's no known badge that was worn by the St. Thomas Troop of Cavalry. Through that
Well, what about this elegant-looking thing here? It looks as if, you know, you'd want to go to Africa and find Livingston with that one.
Right. Well, this was a Woolsey pattern helmet, and it was very typical of that worn by the Canadian militia. There were 2 types of this pattern, and the Fenian Raids, one of the major things that it brought about was the organization of the Canadian militia in Canada. And within a period of about 18 months, there were 57 battalions organized and about a dozen cavalry units. And this helmet and helmet plate, this is the Elgin Infantry 25th, that was our original number, was worn by the militia right up until about or variations of us, up until about 1910.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
We wore those on dress parades when I joined the regiment in 1936. One very similar to just on dress occasions,
right?
With the red tunic.
For heaven's sake.
And we've got a photograph of the unit, the 25th Regiment, going to the Quebec Tercentenary in 1908. And you'll see them wearing their helmets.
But, Brian, were you saying that's a different badge? Was that a badge that was special? Is that the badge that's on this hat?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
There's
Just
about
designed for
5 or 6 different patterns, and it was specially for the 25th Elgin Regiment, the Elgin Battalion of Infantry at that time.
Yeah. But you do have copies of that badge?
Yes, in fact, that's one there, and we're very fortunate to have what is almost a complete collection. It's hard to see here. A complete collection of the badges that were worn by the Army forces in Elgin right up to the present time. This does not include the Air Force or the naval people. And this is the Elgin Regiment specifically, right from 1866 all the way through to the present Queen's Crown, which is worn by the regimental Elgin Regiment people today.
They're really handsome badges, some of them.
They were. These are beautifully struck. These are all die cast, and these 2 on the right are officers, and they're gilt and silver.
Oh, yeah.
And these are all hand embroidered here. They were worn just after the turn of the
You
century.
said you were short one badge.
Yes, we're missing one, and it relates. There was one struck for the tercentenary in 1908, and it's a star pattern badge with a large 25 in it, and it's the only one that we're missing out of that we know of out of all the badges issued to the.
Well, were not many of those badges issued?
Very few.
Yeah,
very
I
few.
see. Yeah. And that's a kind of display again that we'll have in the museum.
Yeah, we'll hope that this will be typical of.
Well, now we've only got up to the first Northwest Rebellion of 1870. We better go on. The 1885 was another rebellion.
Yes.
We have people go to that?
We did not have, the regiment did not go as a whole, but many people from the regiment and the community enlisted with the 7th Battalion, who went out west, or with the 10th out of Toronto, and served out west. And this is a medal that was struck and issued for those who participated in the Northwest Rebellion.
I don't think that's showing on the...
there we are.
And that's called the Saskatchewan. That has Saskatchewan on it,
right? And that was for people who participated at the actions at Batoche or Cut Knife Hill.
And then we, going on quickly from there, we come to the Boer War.
Yes.
And how many people do we have in that Boer War?
We had about 19 that we know of. That many of them left the regiment. Many of them gave up commissions. And went overseas, and we had, again, that was, I believe, our second fatal casualty was suffered in South Africa.
And this won't be very clear, is a picture of the Boer War people, and one of these is Fred Green's father.
Right.
Yes, and he's the one who resigned a commission to go over.
He was one of them. Another gentleman in there was Westaway, H.H. Westaway, who was a veteran of the 1885 rebellion. And his family lives in Lyndhurst.
Well, you know, we haven't begun to look at half of these. We haven't even talked about the last two wars. But I think we've certainly got some idea about how old the military tradition is in Elgin County. But perhaps we better say something in the First World War. Perhaps we better say something about the 91st. Maybe this isn't fair to everybody else who went, but what about 91st was our whole battalion?
Yes, it was the Elgin Overseas Battalion. It originally came to life in October 1915 and went overseas in June of 1916. They suffered 1/6 of the people who went overseas were fatal casualties, and 50% of the remaining suffered some sort of wound or were gassed and that's for people who probably hadn't been 40 and 50 miles away from home and are all of a sudden now put into this type of situation. It had a fairly calamitous effect on the community for a while.
Am I right? You said 1/6 of them were killed.
1/6 of the battalion.
That's awful, right? And then how many were wounded?
Another 50% of those, which would probably have been 500 or 600 men. But there was a large contingent of men volunteered prior to that, including there were 3 signalmen left the area right at the beginning of the war. They left 2 or 3 days after war was declared.
Now, then the Second World War, of course, the Elgin, when did the Elgin Regiment? It went over very early, didn't it?
Well, no, we mobilized in the spring, 1st of June, 1940. And we went overseas in 1942. The first, well, at that time, I wasn't with the regiment. I was on as a liaison officer at Fort Dibb. And we landed a week before Dieppe in August of that year. We mobilized as infantry, changed to armor when General Worthington took over the Fort Dibb. They disbanded one of the armored brigades, but because of the mechanical record of the Elgins, which is extremely high, they were made into an armored delivery, or as it was known that day, tank delivery. And I knew this very well because I was keeping these records at Fort Dibb headquarters at that time. And they went through the war. We had a headquarters. After I left England, I never saw the headquarters again because we went to all the various units. But those...
Well, some of the Elgins went to Italy, didn't they?
Yes, that's where I went. I went to Sicily, up through Italy. And we eventually had 4 squadrons out there.
And, of course, the records of the you know, like the nominal rolls and all this thing for the 91st Battalion, the Elgins, we have those.
They're in that book, in the history. And as a matter of fact, down the roads, we know it for the Fenian Raids, then they're pretty complete.
Yes, it took us quite a long time to compile them, but they're
Pretty complete.
pretty accurate, I think.
This is one of the things I think that everybody is, more and more, we seem to be getting very interested in our past, eh? Maybe it's because we have a little more leisure now. I don't know what it is. But
I think probably in my case because we have less future.
Pardon?
I say in my case because we have less future.
Yeah, I guess so. That's a dreary note. We got 1 minute. I'm sorry you brought that up, Ed, because our mortality is limited, all right. I'd like to thank Brian and Ed, or I should say Lieutenant Sim and Lieutenant Colonel King, very much for coming on the program and talking about the Elgin Military Museum. I'd like to remind everybody that's looking at it, if you have any names, if you want to give some money to the museum, you can get in touch with Lieutenant Colonel King or with any of the members of that committee. And you watch your newspaper, there'll be articles in there. And thank you very much for watching. We'll be on the second Wednesday in January. I'm not sure what I'm going to do then, but I think we may talk about St. Thomas artists. And there again, some of the St. Thomas artists were war artists, especially Osgood, who went overseas at an advanced age, tricked the Army authorities into letting him go, and became a military artist for the British or Canadian Army, and we have some of his paintings in St. Thomas. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.